It's a little bit difficult, I suppose, for most of us to relate to the work of a shepherd. I don't know how many people have ever actually done that work here. It'd be interesting to find out. Has anybody ever acted the part of a shepherd? I don't mean just farming with sheep, but has anybody done that? Nobody's had any experience with that. Well, maybe it's just as well. It's a difficult image, but I was thinking this last week, what sort of an image could you possibly think of that would correspond to that in our own day and age? And I couldn't come up with anything that even remotely approaches it. So we have this image of Jesus as the shepherd, and it remains for us to kind of explore a little bit about what that means. When I spent a summer in Israel some time ago, back in 1996, I had a totally unexpected opportunity to witness a shepherd working with his sheep. And I had thought before, because of what I had learned in Sunday school, that shepherds were, pretty much pastoral characters who were always seen as being very gentle, and they are that. But what was so interesting about watching this shepherd at work was the way in which he interacted with the sheep and the immense kind of, not so obvious, but beneath the surface, strength and tenacity and endurance that this guy had. But here's a guy who was spending all of his time outdoors with the sheep and was used to every one of them, and the one that I saw working was working with probably 200 sheep. I mean, I'm guessing, but it was at least that many, and he was able somehow or another to connect with every one of them and to be able to relate to them. To me, they all look pretty much alike, but not to him. Well, I saw that a little bit in terms of my dad being a dairy farmer, and we didn't have that many cows because it was all sort of, hand-intensive there, that kind of work, if you get my drift. But he knew the characteristics of every one of those cattle too. So, it's kind of interesting when you're in that sort of context that intimacy develops. And to be a shepherd in Israel was more than about watching literal shepherds taking care of their sheep, but they used that term to describe all kinds of people who had leadership roles in the community, and sometimes that was a spiritual one, but it was just as well people who served as elders or counselors or kings. They were all called shepherds. And, when Jesus talks about some of those shepherds not being so good, I guess we can relate to that. That sometimes they acted more in their own interest than they did in the interest of the ones that were in their care. Jesus talks about himself as the good shepherd. And when he goes to explain what that means, he goes into that phrase where he says, I know my own, and my own know me. There is an intimacy about that is difficult to put into words. It's the kind of knowledge that you have not from reading books or looking at descriptions of people, learning about people, but it's the kind of knowledge that you have by spending time with people. That kind of knowledge, that kind of intimacy is what he's talking about here. I know my own. And I often think what that means to any of us, to be so thoroughly known by someone who doesn't run away from us, but who stays and only intensifies that relationship, to be known to that degree. I know my own. And the other side of it is my own know me. And that is kind of a sense of this trusting relationship that builds up, not because we've read all the theology books or all of that kind of thing to talk about who Jesus is, but because we've developed in this relationship with him, we know he's somebody we can trust. He's somebody we can trust above all others. I know my own, and my own know me. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. We know how that plays out in the cross. That's the center of what we know about Jesus Christ, the one who lays down his life for the sheep. That's us. That's the people of the world. Some people know it, and some don't. Some are still waiting to hear it, to experience some sense of that kind of love. And then we define love as Christians, not by looking at dictionaries or by listening to the commercials and the advertisements that are around us, which say all kinds of things about love, but we, as followers of Jesus, know love by this, that Jesus laid down his life for us. When we come to define what love is, that's where we go first, and everything else flows out of that. We know love by this, that Jesus laid down his life for us. And then we ask, what does that mean for us? Well, what difference does it make in our lives? That this one who laid down his life for us and was raised from the dead by the power of the Father lives today? What does that mean for us? John puts it this way: we ought to lay down our lives for one another. What a statement that is, huh? He's saying that to that Christian community that he knew in those early years, that we ought to lay down our lives for one another. And I think that doesn't necessarily mean that we would die for each other, but that we have that kind of interest in each other's welfare, that we will lay aside the things that are central to us, not because we have to, but out of love, to look after the needs of one another, to lay down our lives for each other. It's an immensely powerful statement. And what he means by that, I think, is fleshed out in what he says in these words. How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses help? That's why we do the kinds of ministries that we do as a congregation. I think that's what motivates the quilters to do what they do. It motivates all of the different ministries in our congregation, is this sense of living out the love that we have first come to know in Jesus Christ. It's not a question of our doing these things as kind of a tacked on additional thing that we may or may not do as we choose, but it's this inner impelling motive to live toward others the love that God has shown to us in Jesus Christ. We do it because deep down we can't help it. It comes from that deep inside of us. There's a big difference between someone saying what we, you, I ought to do. That's the old punch of the law. It says, you got to do it. You know, God's not going to be happy with you unless you do it. And the other kind of an ought that arises from deep down inside and doesn't have to, it maybe can be encouraged, but isn't punched on and driven on and prodded on as if with a cattle prod, you know. Just comes up welling up from inside and expresses itself. The love of God that we've come to know in Jesus. That's what comes out of what John was talking about. We know love by this, that Jesus laid down his life for us. I know my own, and my own know me. And so John, just offering encouragement, says, look, when you hear the stories, a little bit about the difference that love makes in people's lives and how those lives are changed, then you'll know what I'm talking about when I say, brothers and sisters, let us continue to love. Not in word or speech, but in truth and in action. That's a transforming power like loose in the world. God bless you, and peace be with you.